He returned on a train that arrived 5 minutes late. It was the summer of 1946, and the station looked smaller than he remembered. The clock above the platform still ticked too loudly, the way it always had, but the benches had been repainted, and a new sign advertised fresh bread across the square. Life, it seemed, had resumed with remarkable efficiency. Samuel Weiss stepped down with a single suitcase and a body that no longer trusted crowds. He was 38 years old. He had left this town 7 years earlier with his parents, his younger sister, and the assumption that memory was permanent. He returned alone, carrying papers stamped and restamped by authorities who had no interest in what those papers represented. No one was waiting for him. That he could have understood. What unsettled him was something quieter. People looked at him and then looked away. Not with fear, not with hostility, with something practiced, polite. The butcher nodded as if greeting a distant acquaintance. A woman he recognized instantly, though her hair had gone gray, smiled briefly, then turned to speak to someone else. Names hovered on Samuel's tongue and fell back unspoken. The town moved around him smoothly, like water flowing past a stone. The street smelled the same: dust, summer heat, coffee. Even the bakery window still displayed the same kind of loaves, stacked neatly, crusts catching the light. Samuel felt a strange pull in his chest, not nostalgia, but disorientation. He had imagined many versions of this moment: accusations, tears, silence heavy with guilt. He had not imagined normality. This story is not about what was destroyed during the war. It is about what was quietly edited afterward. Samuel walked to the building where his family had lived. The door had been replaced. The nameplate beside it was gone. Inside, voices echoed, unfamiliar, comfortable, unafraid. He stood on the landing longer than necessary, hand hovering near the wall where pencil marks had once measured a child's height. The wall was freshly painted. No marks remained. At the municipal office, the clerk flipped through records without meeting his eyes. "Yes," she said finally, "the Weiss family is listed as departed." "Departed where?" Samuel asked. She hesitated, just long enough. "During the war," she replied, and stamped the page as if the sentence were complete. Outside, Samuel sat on a bench in the square and watched people pass. Children ran. A man laughed loudly. Someone argued about prices. The town was not hostile. It was worse than that. It was intact. No plaques, no empty storefronts, no acknowledgement of absence. The war here had been filed away like an inconvenience. Samuel realized then that survival had not prepared him for this version of return, one where memory was optional and silence was shared by everyone except him. He opened his suitcase and removed a single photograph, worn thin at the edges. It was proof that something had existed before this place decided to move on. And as he folded it carefully and put it back, one thought settled heavily in his mind. If everyone was pretending nothing happened, what would it cost him to refuse? Before the war, Samuel had believed his town was incapable of forgetting. It was the kind of place where routines mattered more than ambition. Shops opened at the same hour every morning. Conversations repeated themselves with minor variations. People knew who had quarreled, who owed money, who had lost someone too young. Memory was communal. It lingered in doorways and followed you home. That belief collapsed quietly. Samuel spent his first days walking streets he knew by heart, testing them against what they had become. The schoolyard was full again. The synagogue doors were closed, not damaged, simply unused, as if neglect were a neutral decision. He noticed how easily buildings survived when stories did not. Relationships, once automatic, now required negotiation. He ran into his former neighbor near the river. The man recognized him instantly. Samuel saw it in the pause, the sharp intake of breath. Then came the adjustment, a smile, a handshake held half a second too short. Questions about health, about travel, nothing about absence. "My parents," Samuel began. The man interrupted gently. "Hard times," he said, nodding toward the water. "Everyone lost something." The sentence ended the conversation, not cruelly, efficiently. Samuel realized the fracture was not ignorance, it was agreement. People here had decided, without discussion, that the past was inconvenient. Mourning required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement required responsibility. Silence was simpler. Silence allowed life to continue without rearranging its moral furniture. He visited the cemetery next. The stones from his family's plot were gone. Not broken, removed. The space had been leveled, grass planted carefully, as if erasure could be tidy. A caretaker explained that unused sections had been reorganized after the war. Records were incomplete. Things had been chaotic. Chaos, Samuel learned, was a useful explanation. The looming shadow followed him everywhere. Not fear, but isolation. He was the only person in town for whom the war had not ended. For everyone else, it was an episode, closed, summarized, archived. At night, Samuel slept poorly. Familiar sounds triggered instinctive vigilance. Laughter outside his window tightened his chest. He replayed conversations, searching for cracks where truth might still enter. There were none. The first irreversible turn came at the bakery. Samuel asked calmly about the Weiss apartment above the shop. The owner stiffened, flour still on his hands. That was reassigned, legally. To whom? Samuel asked. The man met his eyes for the first time. It doesn't matter now. That was when Samuel understood the rule he had not been told. Survival was permitted, return was not. The town could tolerate his presence only if he did not ask it to remember, only if he agreed to participate in the fiction that nothing essential had been lost. As he left the bakery, Samuel felt the old weight settled back into his body, the one he had carried through camps and documents and trains. But this weight was different. This one asked him to choose. Would he accept the comfort of silence, or would he become something far more dangerous to this town than memory? Someone who refused to disappear quietly.
Samuel began to notice the mechanics of forgetting. It wasn't random. It wasn't passive. Forgetting here was maintained through habits, small, coordinated choices repeated often enough to feel natural. People crossed the street to avoid longer conversations. Shopkeepers kept exchanges brief and transactional. Questions were redirected toward weather, prices, repairs, anything except the years that sat between before and now. The town had not erased the past. It had compartmentalized it. Samuel tested this carefully. He mentioned names in casual tones, as if recalling something trivial. The reactions were immediate and consistent, a flicker of recognition, followed by withdrawal. Shoulders tightened, eyes shifted. The response was not denial, it was containment. The micro-twist came from someone who did not look away. An elderly woman stopped him outside the post office. She did not pretend not to know him. She said his name softly, as if speaking it too loudly might break something fragile. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for his sleeve. "I'm glad you're alive," she said. Then she released him and walked away before he could answer. The moment stayed with him all day. It proved what he had suspected. People remembered. They were choosing not to share that memory publicly. Remembrance had become private,
almost illicit. Samuel visited the municipal archives next. The building smelled of paper and polish. Files were neatly labeled, shelves orderly. Nothing here suggested loss. He requested property records, school rosters, residency lists. The clerk retrieved them without comment. Pages were intact, but altered. Names removed, addresses reassigned, margins annotated with phrases like vacant, relocated, no longer applicable. The past had been edited, not destroyed. Samuel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had seen this process before, in camps, in offices. Systems preferred cleanliness. Ambiguity created liability. The first true fracture came when Samuel recognized his father's handwriting. It appeared in a ledger from 1939, authorizing a small business payment. The entry ended abruptly. The following page skipped ahead months. Nothing explained the gap. The silence felt intentional. Samuel closed the book carefully. This was not just forgetting, it was self-preservation. Acknowledging what had happened would require admitting who had benefited from absence. Shops reopened, apartments reassigned, businesses continued under new ownership. The town's stability had been rebuilt on subtraction. That night, Samuel sat in his room and spread out the few objects he had brought with him: papers, documents, the photograph. Each item contradicted the town's version of continuity. Together, they formed an alternative record, one that did not fit neatly into local memory. The moral dilemma crystallized slowly. If Samuel spoke openly, he would fracture the town's peace. If he stayed silent, he would participate in the erasure of his own family. Survival had taught him when to keep his head down. Return demanded a different skill. He realized then that the town was testing him, not explicitly, but persistently. How long would he stay? How loudly would he speak? How much discomfort was he willing to cause by existing honestly? As he folded the photograph and placed it back in his case, Samuel understood the risk clearly. In this town, remembering was an act of resistance, and resistance, even quiet resistance, rarely went unanswered. The pressure did not arrive as threats. It arrived as courtesy. People began to check on Samuel, casually. A knock at the door with an offer of leftover soup, a polite inquiry about how long he planned to stay. Suggestions delivered gently, framed as concern. It must be difficult, they said, being here alone. The implication sat just beneath the words. Leaving would be easier for everyone. Samuel recognized the tactic. It was the same logic that governed camps and offices alike. Contain the problem without appearing to create one. Force without force. Compliance disguised as kindness. The town was not hostile. It was managing him. The micro-twist came from a place he did not expect, the school. Samuel visited the building one afternoon, drawn by the sound of children reciting lessons through open windows. Inside, the hallways smelled of chalk and polish. He asked, politely, if records from before the war were still kept. The headmaster stiffened, almost imperceptibly, then nodded. In a small office, Samuel was shown a ledger. Class lists, attendance, names written carefully in ink. He scanned the pages until he found his sister's name, Leah, followed by a neat line drawn through it. No explanation, no date, just a line. She transferred, the headmaster said quickly. Many children did. Samuel said nothing. The headmaster continued, speaking too fast now. It was a confusing time. Families moved. Records were difficult to maintain. The explanation hung in the air, thin and fragile. That night, Samuel understood something essential. The town was not pretending nothing happened because it did not know. It was pretending Because it did. Knowledge demanded reckoning. Reckoning threatened stability. Stability had become the town's highest value, even above truth. The moral dilemma sharpened into focus. Samuel could file claims, demand restitution, insist on formal acknowledgement. The law, fragmented but functional, would support him in pieces. But every action would be public. Every step would force the town to confront what it had gained by forgetting. He imagined the faces he had seen in the square, the bakery owner, the clerk, the neighbors who smiled too carefully. None of them had arrested his family. None had signed orders, but they had lived in the space that absence created. That counted for something. Samuel realized then that return was not neutral act. It was an accusation simply by existing. The town wanted him gone not because he threatened it physically, but because he disrupted the story it told itself about continuity and innocence. He began to write. Not petitions, not demands, letters, carefully worded, factual, restrained. To regional offices, to historical committees, to anyone who archived rather than erased. He attached copies of documents, names, dates, proof. The response was slow, but it came. An official inquiry was opened, not dramatic, administrative, but real. The town felt the shift immediately. People stopped offering soup, conversations shortened, doors closed more firmly. Samuel felt the air change around him, not with anger, but with exposure. Silence was no longer sufficient. Someone was listening now. As he sealed another envelope, Samuel felt the familiar calculation settle in his chest. Survival had once meant staying quiet. Now, survival might require the opposite, and the town, for the first time since his return, seemed unsure whether it could outweight him.
The inquiry did not arrive like justice. It arrived like paperwork. A letterhead, a reference number, a request for clarification. The town reacted not with outrage, but with anxiety, the low-grade, persistent kind that settles into conversations and refuses to leave. Samuel noticed it immediately. People avoided his eyes now, not out of politeness, but calculation. His presence had acquired weight. The micro-twist came with speed. Within weeks, a regional official arrived, not dramatic, not accusatory. He toured the square, reviewed documents, spoke to clerks in low voices. The process was procedural, but its implications were unmistakable. Records were being compared, timelines questioned, ownership traced. Memory was becoming measurable. Samuel was called to the municipal office again. This time, the clerk did not avoid his gaze. She spoke carefully, as if every word might be recorded. There were irregularities, she admitted. Post-war reassignment happened quickly. Some properties were never meant to be permanent. Never meant to be permanent. The phrase echoed. Temporary had lasted decades. Samuel walked the streets differently now. He felt the tension coil around him, not as threat, but as exposure. People who had once dismissed him now watched him closely. The bakery owner closed early. The post office shortened hours. Stability, he realized, was fragile when examined too closely. The moral dilemma sharpened again. The inquiry could restore property. It could result in plaques, acknowledgments, official language that recognized loss, but it could not restore parents or siblings or the childhood that had ended somewhere far from this intact square. Samuel asked himself what he wanted. Not compensation, not apology. What he wanted was rupture, a break in the fiction that had allowed this place to move on without accounting for who had been removed. He wanted the town to remember out loud.
The pressure escalated quietly. A man stopped him one evening near the river. "You should consider what you're doing," he said, not unkindly. "People are uneasy." Samuel nodded. Unease, he thought, was appropriate. Then came the threat, disguised as advice. "Some of us stayed," the man added. "We rebuilt. We didn't have the luxury of leaving." Samuel met his eyes. "Neither did we," he said. The sentence ended the conversation. That night, Samuel realized that return was never about reclaiming the past. It was about interrupting the present. The inquiry advanced. Requests multiplied. Files were cross-checked against regional archives. Names resurfaced. The town's carefully managed amnesia began to crack, not violently, but audibly. You could hear it in pauses, in conversations that stopped when Samuel entered a room. For the first time since his arrival, he felt something shift. The town was no longer pretending nothing had happened. It was deciding how much of what had happened it could survive admitting. And Samuel understood then that the most dangerous moment was not confrontation, it was negotiation. Because negotiation implied compromise, and compromise risked turning memory into something small enough to tolerate. The town adjusted again, the way systems always do when pressure becomes unavoidable. Not everyone resisted. Some complied quietly. A plaque was discussed, a small ceremony proposed, tasteful, contained, scheduled at a time when attendance could be managed. Language was drafted carefully. Victims of the war. Those who never returned. Passive phrases, polished smooth enough to avoid naming responsibility. Samuel recognized the strategy immediately. Memory offered in controlled portions became manageable. Acknowledgement without consequence. Mourning without disruption. The town was learning how to remember safely. The micro-twist came from someone who broke rank. The butcher, the same man who had once nodded politely and changed the subject, approached Samuel after closing time. His hands shook as he spoke. "My father took over your family's shop," he said. "He said it was temporary. Then it wasn't." Samuel listened without interrupting. "He told himself it was better this way," the man continued, "that if no one talked about it, no one would be blamed." The confession was not an apology. It was something else, exhaustion. Carrying silence for decades had a cost, and the inquiry had finally made it visible. Others followed, not publicly, privately. Brief admissions in doorways, half-sentences on empty streets. No one claimed innocence, no one claimed guilt outright. They spoke instead of necessity, fear, opportunity, survival. The same words Samuel had heard before, in different places, under harsher conditions. The parallel unsettled him. The town, he realized, had survived the war the way camps survived hunger, by adapting morally as much as practically. People learned what could be justified if framed as unavoidable. Over time, justification hardened into habit. The moral dilemma reached its final shape. Samuel could accept the plaque, the ceremony, the version of memory that allowed everyone, including himself, to move forward with minimal disruption, or he could refuse containment. He could insist on names, on specifics, on a memory that did not fit neatly into stone or speech. The cost of refusal was clear. He would become the reason the town could not heal quietly. He would remain an irritant, a reminder, a presence that prevented closure. He would not be thanked for this. Samuel thought of the photograph in his suitcase, of his sister's name crossed out with a single line, of walls repainted where pencil marks had once measured growth. Closure, he understood, was a privilege of those who had been erased. At the meeting with officials, Samuel spoke calmly. "I don't want a plaque. I want the records corrected. I want the names restored where they were removed. I want the gaps marked as gaps." Silence followed. That request was harder to manage, harder to aestheticize. It required admitting that the town's continuity was built on subtraction, and that subtraction had beneficiaries. As Samuel left the room, he felt no relief, but he felt alignment. The town would remember now, not because it wanted to, but because forgetting had finally become impossible. And that, Samuel realized, was the only kind of memory that lasted. Samuel left the town at the end of summer, not because he was asked to, but because his work there was finished. The records were amended slowly, not all at once. Names reappeared in ledgers with annotations instead of erasures. Properties were marked with explanations rather than reassigned without comment. The gaps were no longer smoothed over, they were labeled. The town learned to live with footnotes. There was no ceremony. No crowd gathered, no speeches were given. The plaque proposal dissolved quietly, replaced by something less visible and more permanent: accuracy. Memory stripped of comfort, but anchored in fact. Samuel understood that this outcome would disappoint many. There would be no moment of collective catharsis, no symbolic closure, only persistence. On his final morning, he walked through the square one last time. It looked unchanged. Children still ran, shops still opened, bread was still stacked behind glass. Life had not collapsed under the weight of truth. It had adjusted, uneasily but honestly. A woman stopped him near the station. Not the elderly one, someone younger. She hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether she was allowed to. "My son asked me why some names came back into the books," she said. "I didn't know what to tell him." Samuel considered this carefully. "Tell him they were always there. We just stopped pretending otherwise." On the train, Samuel took out the photograph one last time. He studied the faces, not to grieve, not to recover what could not be returned, but to confirm something he now understood with clarity. Return was never about reclaiming a place. It was about refusing the terms under which that place had rewritten itself. Samuel did not carry bitterness with him. He carried something heavier and more precise: responsibility. The knowledge that survival did not end with living. It continued in what you demanded afterward, in how loudly you insisted on accuracy when silence would be easier. Years later, historians would describe towns like this one as complex, as morally ambiguous. Samuel had no objection to those words. Complexity, after all, was honest. What he rejected was comfort built on emission. This was what he left behind: not anger, not vengeance, not even forgiveness, but interruption. A pause in the story the town told itself, and in that pause, space enough for truth to exist without being smoothed away. Samuel never returned. He didn't need to. The town would carry him now, not as a ghost, not as an accusation, but as a correction. And sometimes, correction is the most enduring form of memory there is. Samuel left the town at the end of summer, not because he was asked to, but because his work there was finished. The records were amended slowly, not all at once. Names reappeared in ledgers with annotations instead of erasures. Properties were marked with explanations rather than reassigned without comment. The gaps were no longer smoothed over, they were labeled. The town learned to live with footnotes. There was no ceremony, no crowd gathered, no speeches were given. The plaque proposal dissolved quietly, replaced by something less visible and more permanent: accuracy. Memory stripped of comfort, but anchored in fact. Samuel understood that this outcome would disappoint many. There would be no moment of collective catharsis, no symbolic closure, only persistence. On his final morning, he walked through the square one last time. It looked unchanged. Children still ran, shops still opened, bread was still stacked behind glass. Life had not collapsed under the weight of truth. It had adjusted, uneasily but honestly. A woman stopped him near the station. Not the elderly one, someone younger. She hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether she was allowed to. "My son asked me why some names came back into the books," she said. "I didn't know what to tell him." Samuel considered this carefully. "Tell him they were always there," he said. "We just stopped pretending otherwise." On the train, Samuel took out the photograph one last time. He studied the faces, not to grieve, not to recover what could not be returned, but to confirm something he now understood with clarity. Return was never about reclaiming a place. It was about refusing the terms under which that place had rewritten itself. Samuel did not carry bitterness with him. He carried something heavier and more precise: responsibility. The knowledge that survival did not end with living. It continued in what you demanded afterward, in how loudly you insisted on accuracy when silence would be easier. Years later, historians would describe towns like this one as complex, as morally ambiguous. Samuel had no objection to those words. Complexity, after all, was honest. What he rejected was comfort built on a mission. This was what he left behind: not anger, not vengeance, not even forgiveness, but interruption. A pause in the story the town told itself. And in that pause, space enough for truth to exist without being smoothed away. Samuel never returned. He didn't need to. The town would carry him now, not as a ghost, not as an accusation, but as a correction. And sometimes correction is the most enduring form of memory there is.